It was a quiet Tuesday evening, and the restaurant was almost empty, save for a few scattered tables. The faint smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread lingered in the air, mixing with the soft hum of the air conditioning. Robert, a man in his late 60s, sat at the corner table by the window. His face, weathered with years of experience, carried the weight of the battles he had fought, not just in war, but in life. His uniformed days long past, Robert had taken on the mantle of a quiet, solitary man who spent his afternoons reading the paper, his nights at a small diner, where he could enjoy the solitude of a hot meal. Tonight, as usual, he sat with a cup of coffee in front of him, reading his newspaper, with the occasional glance outside at the falling rain. The world outside was quiet, too. The street lights flickered in the drizzle, casting a soft glow on the pavement. Everything seemed calm. But then, a voice broke the silence. "Sir," I said, "what do you want to eat?" The voice was sharp and impatient, laced with an undertone of frustration. It was the waitress. Sarah, a young woman who had started working at the diner a few months ago, walked up to his table with a scowl on her face. Robert looked up slowly, blinking in confusion. "Excuse me," he asked, raising an eyebrow, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "I've been standing here for a minute." "What do you want to eat?" Sarah repeated, her tone even more impatient than before. She was visibly irritated, perhaps with the lack of customers that night or with the long shifts she had been working. Her voice cracked with frustration, but Robert, taken aback by the suddenness of the encounter, simply stared at her. "Maybe just a soup, miss," he replied softly, his voice carrying the calmness that only a lifetime of experiences could bring. Sarah scoffed. "Soup? That's all? Don't you want something more?" She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly annoyed. "We don't have time for people like you to sit here all night with just soup." Her words hung in the air like a slap to his face. Robert's expression faltered. He didn't want to make a scene, but the words stung. "I'm just here for a meal," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Is that a problem?" "I'm just tired of dealing with customers like you," Sarah shot back, her frustration reaching a boiling point. She didn't know why she had lashed out, but the stress of life, the endless hours, and the mundane conversations with customers had taken a toll. The veteran in front of her, with his old jacket and weathered face, seemed just another person to take out her frustration on. But then, something shifted. A shadow seemed to pass over Robert's face. For a moment, he looked away, as though pulling himself back from some distant memory. Sarah didn't notice it at first, but when she did, her irritation gave way to a sense of unease. Robert's hands, rough and scarred from years of work, and perhaps more, trembled slightly as he placed the menu back on the table. "Look," he began slowly, his voice quieter than before, "I served my country when I was your age. I fought in wars you'll never understand. I've seen things that no one should have to see. And you're upset over soup? I don't think you know what real tired feels like, miss." Sarah's face went pale. The words hit her harder than she expected. She froze, caught between the desire to apologize and the shame that suddenly crept into her chest. Robert's eyes had turned hard, but there was no anger in them, only the deep, weary weight of years. For a moment, they stood there in silence. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, the anger in her fading into guilt. She had crossed a line, and now she could see the pain behind the eyes of the man in front of her. She had no right to lash out at him, not after all he had endured. "I didn't mean it." Robert nodded slowly, not saying anything more. He didn't need to. There was an understanding between them now, one that transcended the moment, but it also left something unsettled. Just as Sarah turned to walk away, a man from another table, who had overheard the exchange, stood up. He was older, around Robert's age, with graying hair and the same weathered look. "You know," he said softly to Sarah, "I fought in Vietnam. My buddy here, he fought in World War II. We've seen enough to last a lifetime." Sarah stood frozen, unsure how to respond. She glanced back at Robert, who had lowered his head, as if lost in his thoughts once more. She could tell the two men had an unspoken bond, one she would never fully understand. That's why we don't waste our time fighting with each other, the older man continued. We've learned what really matters. Sarah was left standing there, feeling the weight of her mistake pressed down on her shoulders. And from that moment on, she saw the world a little differently, a little more quietly, and a little more respectfully. Sarah stood by the counter for a moment, her thoughts racing. She had never really thought about the weight that veterans carried with them. She had always been so focused on her own life, her own frustrations. She hadn't realized how those frustrations could spill over and hurt others. The exchange with Robert had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. As she cleared another table, she couldn't help but glance over at him. He was still sitting there, his back slightly hunched, his hands wrapped around his cup of coffee. He wasn't looking at her now, and she didn't know if she should approach him again or leave him be. The guilt was gnawing at her, though. She had worked as a waitress for long enough to know when a customer needed space, but something about the way Robert had spoken made her want to make amends. She had learned something tonight, something that wouldn't leave her anytime soon. After a few more minutes of cleaning, Sarah walked over to Robert's table. This time, she didn't stand with her arms crossed or tapping her foot impatiently. She approached him quietly, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Mr. Robert," she said softly, trying to get his attention. He looked up slowly, his expression neutral. "Yes?" "I owe you an apology," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "What I said. I was wrong. I shouldn't have spoken to you that way. I didn't understand, and I'm sorry for that." Robert didn't say anything right away. He just looked at her, studying her face as if weighing her sincerity. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "It's all right," he said. "People get tired. They say things they don't mean sometimes. I've done it myself." Sarah nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, that the weight of his words wasn't just about this moment. She wanted to know more. "You said you fought in World War II, she asked, her voice soft. "What was that like?" Robert's face softened as he leaned back in his chair. His eyes grew distant as if he was staring into a place beyond the diner, beyond the rain outside, into something far deeper. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, as if pulled from a memory, he spoke. "I was young, just like you," he began, his voice carrying the weight of years. "But I wasn't thinking about my life, or what I wanted. I was thinking about the men around me. I didn't know what I was getting into when I signed up. We thought it would be quick, easy. But it wasn't. The things I saw, the things we all saw, they stay with you. They change you." Sarah didn't know what to say. She just listened, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she tried to imagine what he must have experienced. What it must have been like to face something so big, so beyond his control. "We did what we had to," Robert continued, his voice taking on a quiet resolve. "But I never got to come back and pretend everything was fine. Some people don't come back at all. I came back to a world that didn't really want to know about what happened. The nightmares never really leave you." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had always thought of veterans as just old men in uniforms, or as people who were celebrated on holidays. But she had never considered the personal cost of their service. She had never thought about what they carried in silence. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered again, unsure if it was enough. "I didn't realize how much you've been through." Robert looked up at her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You'll understand someday. Everyone has their battles, Sarah. Maybe they are not the same as mine, but they are battles all the same." For a few moments, they just stood there in silence. Then Sarah cleared her throat and gave him a tentative smile. "Can I get you anything else? Maybe something stronger than soup?" Robert chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to come from deep within him. "I'd appreciate a refill on my coffee." She turned to leave but hesitated for a moment before turning back. "Mr. Robert, thank you for sharing that with me. I'll try to do better. I promise." With a final nod, she walked back to the counter, her heart lighter than it had been before. As she filled the coffee pot and carried it back to Robert's table, she couldn't help but feel a sense of connection with him now, something deeper than a simple apology. She had seen him, truly seen him, and for the first time, she understood the quiet strength of his presence. And Robert, for his part, had learned something as well. Sometimes it wasn't about winning the battle, but about letting go of the hurt that came from it. In the quiet of that diner, two people from different worlds had found a brief moment of understanding. As Sarah refilled his cup, she smiled at him. He smiled back. They didn't need to say anything more. The connection had been made. As Sarah refilled Robert's coffee, the steady rhythm of the diner returned to normal. The usual hum of conversations, the clink of silverware, and the soft whir of the coffee machine filled the air. Yet, for Sarah, everything felt different. The weight of her earlier frustration had lifted, replaced by a new understanding. It was like something had shifted in the way she saw the world. The young waitress had grown, if only just a little, in the span of a few minutes. As she went about her work, her mind often returned to Robert's words. Everyone has their battles, he had said. She wasn't sure exactly what her own battles were, but she knew that they weren't as grand or as harrowing as his. They were smaller, more personal, but they were real. She thought about the way she had lashed out earlier, how she had let her own frustrations get the better of her. She vowed to do better, to see people not just for what they appeared to be, but for what they had endured. It wasn't just Robert who deserved respect. Every person who walked through the diner's door had their own story. The evening passed in a blur. By the time Robert finished his coffee, the restaurant was closing. Sarah wiped down the tables and began preparing to leave. As she passed Robert's table one last time, she hesitated, remembering the unspoken connection they had shared. "I'm heading out now, Mr. Robert," she said, her voice softer than before. "I hope you have a good night." He looked up at her and smiled, his expression warmer than it had been earlier. "You too, Sarah. And remember what I said, sometimes the battles are quieter than we think." "I'll try," she replied. "Good night." As she stepped out into the cool night air, Sarah walked to her car, her steps slower than usual. She felt a strange sense of peace, as if the conversation with Robert had opened up something inside her. She had always been quick to judge, quick to let her frustrations shape her actions. But now, she saw things differently. Maybe it wasn't about trying to control everything around her, about rushing through life to get to the next thing. Maybe it was about stopping, listening, and trying to understand the people in her life. The people who were fighting their own battles in silence. Back in the diner, Robert sat for a few more minutes, his hands wrapped around the warm mug. The storm outside had calmed, and the streetlights now reflected off the wet pavement. He wasn't in a rush to leave. There was no hurry anymore. He thought about the young woman, the waitress who had been quick to anger, but who had also been quick to apologize. She had reminded him of someone, maybe his younger self, or maybe someone he had known long ago. It didn't matter. The important thing was that she had listened, even if just for a moment. That was all it took. Sometimes, that's all you needed to make a difference in the world. As Robert stood up to leave, he cast one last glance around the diner. The familiar surroundings, the small comforts, felt like home, a place where stories were shared, where people connected without even realizing it. He had learned that sometimes, even in the most ordinary moments, there was something extraordinary. Something worth remembering. The door swung open as he stepped out into the night. The rain had stopped, but the air was still thick with the scent of fresh earth. Robert pulled his coat tighter around him, taking a deep breath. The world felt quieter now, and for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. Not because the battles had ended, but because he had learned to share them, even with someone who, until tonight, had been a stranger. As he walked down the street toward his car, he smiled to himself. Sometimes, understanding came in unexpected forms. And sometimes, a simple act of kindness could change the course of someone's day, or even their life. And so, the night went on, quietly, peacefully, as two strangers, once divided by age and experience, found a fleeting connection. A connection that would linger far longer than the brief encounter had seemed to promise. The weeks passed, but the memory of that night stayed with Sarah. Every time she saw Robert, which was often, sitting at his usual corner table by the window, she felt a quiet sense of respect. She had learned something that day, about herself, about people, and about how easily we can overlook the stories of those around us. It wasn't just Robert's words that stuck with her. It was the way he carried himself. Even though his face was lined with the years of his past, there was a calm in him, a peace that Sarah envied. She had noticed how the other diners treated him with subtle reverence. They didn't speak much to him, but they smiled and greeted him warmly. It was as though they knew. They understood that this man had lived through things that most could never imagine. One rainy afternoon, about a month after the incident, Sarah found herself standing behind the counter, wiping down the coffee machine, when Robert walked in. He was a little slower these days, walking with a cane that he hadn't had before. But his presence was still strong, like the quiet of an old tree, standing tall despite the storms it had weathered. "Good afternoon, Mr. Robert," Sarah said, her voice warm with the familiarity that had grown between them. She'd always called him Mr. Robert out of respect, though he had told her once, after the incident, that she could just call him Robert if she liked. "Afternoon, Sarah," he replied with a soft smile, his eyes glinting under the dim light of the diner. He eased into his seat at his usual table, carefully placing the cane beside him. She walked over with a cup of coffee, noticing the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for the mug. "How's the weather out there today?" she asked, trying to keep things light. Robert chuckled, his voice low. "A little damp, as usual. But it reminds me of the old days. Back when we were stationed out in the field during the rain. Always had to stay sharp in weather like that." Sarah paused, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of the counter. She knew what he was hinting at. The years of hardship, of enduring rainstorms and sleepless nights in places far from home. She didn't push him for details, sometimes silence was enough. But she asked, gently, "Do you ever talk about it? What happened back then?" Robert looked up at her, his eyes distant for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "Not much," he said, his voice low. "Some things are easier to leave in the past. But every now and then, when I'm sitting here and it's quiet enough, I think about the guys I served with. The ones who didn't come back." Sarah nodded, understanding that the pain of loss never truly faded, that it merely became something you learned to live with. "I'm sure you miss them." Robert's gaze softened. "We all miss someone. But you learn to carry them with you in the quiet moments. It's funny, you know. Sometimes I think I'm still in that old war, just without the bombs and the chaos. The hardest part is the quiet. When everything settles down and you're alone with your memories, that's when it hits you." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to absorb his words. "I think I understand a little more now. I didn't back then, but I do now." Robert smiled faintly. "Good. It's important to understand. Life doesn't always give you the luxury of being prepared for what's coming. But if you can find peace with it, well, then you've already won half the battle." She stood there for a moment, taking in his words. She didn't have the answers, but she was beginning to feel like she was on the right path. A path where listening was as important as speaking, and where understanding didn't always require words. As the evening wore on, the diner filled with the usual crowd. But Sarah's attention kept drifting back to Robert. She noticed the small things, the way his eyes would momentarily look out the window, as if searching for something only he could see. The way he would gently rub the back of his hand, as if trying to soothe a lingering ache that wouldn't fade. As she cleared his empty coffee cup, she asked, "Do you want to stay a little longer tonight?" Robert's eyes met hers, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah saw a glimmer of something deeper, a quiet sorrow, but also a sense of gratitude. "I think I'll head out soon. I've been sitting here a long time already." She nodded and smiled, knowing that he wasn't just talking about the time in the diner. He was talking about the hours, the days, the years that had passed, and how sometimes, no matter how long you sit with your thoughts, there's always something left unsaid. "Well, if you change your mind, we're always here," Sarah said, her voice sincere. Robert gave her a small smile. "Oh no. That's what keeps me coming back." As he left that night, the doorbell chimed softly, and Sarah stood at the counter, watching him walk slowly into the dark. She couldn't help but think about the battles that raged inside of him, and how, for all the years that had passed, he still carried them with dignity. The memories, the loss, the quiet peace, it was all part of who he was. And Sarah, in her own way, was beginning to understand. Sometimes, the hardest thing in the world wasn't facing the storms outside. It was learning to accept the ones that raged within. The next time Robert came in, she smiled at him with a quiet, unspoken understanding. Life was fragile, and the moments we shared with others, no matter how brief, were precious. And sometimes, just listening was all it took to begin healing. The months continued to pass, and the seasons shifted from the bitter cold of winter to the crisp, fresh air of spring. Sarah had become more attuned to the stories of the people around her, just as she had learned to listen to Robert. The diner, once just a place of work, had become a refuge, not just for the regulars who came in for a cup of coffee, but for Sarah herself. And Robert, for all the years he had lived, had become a part of that refuge as well. He continued to visit, slowing down a little more with each passing week, but his presence remained as steady as ever. Sarah noticed the changes in him, how he sat for longer periods of time, how his steps grew slower, more deliberate. She had learned not to ask questions, but to simply offer comfort in the small ways she could. A warm smile, a refill of coffee, a quiet presence in the midst of the busyness of life. One evening, as Sarah was clearing off a table near Robert's usual spot, he looked up at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. There was a tenderness in his eyes, a softness that spoke of years lived and lessons learned. "I think it's time for me to go, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Sarah paused in her cleaning, not sure what he meant. "Go? What do you mean?" Robert smiled, a peaceful, almost sad smile. "Not go anywhere specific," he said. "Just go. I've been holding on to a lot for a long time, but I think I'm ready to let go now. You've helped me more than you know. You taught me that the battles don't always have to be fought alone. I don't need to sit here anymore. I've done enough remembering." For a moment, Sarah didn't know how to respond. She had always known Robert would eventually leave, not just the diner, but this world. But hearing him say it out loud, with such quiet acceptance, left her speechless. She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "You've taught me a lot too, Robert. About life. About peace." He reached out and placed his hand gently on hers, his grip warm but firm. "I'm glad I could help. And I'm glad I met you. Just promise me one thing, Sarah." "Anything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Don't let the battles make you hard. Don't let them take away your kindness. It's the only thing worth holding on to." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she looked at the man who had shared his world with her. She had never known how to say goodbye to someone who had made such an impact, but somehow, she knew this wasn't the end. Robert wasn't leaving her entirely. He had already given her the most important gift he could. The understanding that even the most painful battles could be faced with kindness, and that sometimes, peace came not from fighting, but from accepting what was. As Robert stood up slowly from his seat, Sarah watched him for a moment, her heart heavy. "I'll never forget you, Robert." He smiled again, that same quiet, contented smile that she had come to recognize. "Good. Don't ever forget. And don't stop listening." With that, he walked out into the night, the door chime ringing softly behind him. Sarah stood there for a long while after he left, reflecting on the journey they had shared, even in such a short time. Robert had given her a gift, a lesson that would stay with her forever. Life wasn't about rushing through each moment. It was about stopping, listening, and finding peace in the stories we shared, the ones we chose to tell and the ones we kept hidden deep within. As Sarah finished cleaning the diner and prepared to close for the night, she smiled softly to herself. Robert had taught her how to truly listen. And she would carry that with her every day, in every interaction, because, in the end, it was the quiet moments of understanding that mattered the most. And though Robert was gone, his lessons lived on, like the quiet echo of a voice that would never be forgotten.